Mormon moms strive to be the pinnacle of mothers. They often have many children and want them to be perfect Mormons too. But what happens when those Mormon moms are a bit unhinged? What happens when their children are in fact human and cannot be perfect? Today, we will look at one of these Mormon moms, Ruby Franke. My name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark. From deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man-made catastrophes. So if that kind of thing is up your alley, come along and let's get morbid. Disclaimer: I am not Mormon, nor have I ever been. But over the last few years, I've developed a weird fascination with high demand religions like Jehovah's Witnesses and, of course, Mormonism. I've watched videos by channels like Cults to Consciousness, Mormon Stories Podcast, and I've watched creators like Jordan and McKay, Jimmy Snow, Alyssa Grenfell, and Exmo Lex. It has led me to find some horrific stories of how Mormonism can lead people to do absolutely despicable things. So, we are going to look at two prime examples of how perfect Molly Mormons became evil Mormon moms. The first mother we will be looking at is Ruby. Ruby Franke has become one of the most hated mothers in America, up there with the likes of Casey Anthony. Not only did she run a family YouTube channel that documented every part of her family's lives, privacy be damned, but she also used highly questionable parenting methods on her 6 children, and often showed these methods on camera. I will talk about 4 of her children in particular: Sherry, who is the oldest, Chad, who is the second oldest, Russell, who is the second youngest, and Eve, who is the youngest. But before we get to specific incidences with specific kids, I wanted to mention 2 things that she has done with all of her children. The first is that Ruby regularly withheld food from her children as punishment, but also as motivation. In one clip I've seen multiple times now, Ruby is telling one of her kids that they're not allowed to have breakfast until all of their chores for the day have been completed.
I said, I'm not even going to let you eat breakfast until you get your chores done.
Now, that might not be legal, but it is completely unbelievable that she thought that was okay. Food first and foremost is fuel for our bodies, and by withholding food, especially after not having eaten all night and then expecting them to do chores for God knows how long, she was not taking her kids' health into consideration. Which brings me to my next point. She also didn't give a crap about her kids' comfort either. When the entire family came down with the stomach flu, she went around interviewing the kids on camera on what it was like sleeping on the bathroom floor all night. Like, what? First of all, her children are miserable and throwing up, and she thought that was a good time to grab a camera and film them? And if that wasn't bad enough, why force your children to sleep on tile floors? They were already in so much physical discomfort, and she literally did nothing to make them feel more comfortable. When my kid has the stomach flu, I let her pick wherever she feels most comfortable, whether that is in my bed, on my couch, sitting in my lap as I slowly lose all feeling in my legs. Does my kid want her blankie, juice, popsicles, soup? Her wish is my command. Do you know why? Because I legitimately love my children, and it hurts my heart when I see them hurting. I can't make them better in that moment, but I can do whatever I can to make it suck a little less. And as a mother, I am very interested in my children being healthy. My older kid, for example, was very prone to ear infections before we got her tubes put in. I'm talking, we were constantly at urgent care for ear infections like clockwork every 3 weeks. She'd get on antibiotics for 10 days, then she'd be healthy for a week, week and a half, and then bam, another ear infection. I also know of a few times that I took her to the emergency room at, 8, 9 o'clock at night because urgent care was closed. But you know what? There we were, sitting at the hospital, waiting to be seen because I couldn't stand seeing my kid in pain and being sick. You know who didn't do that? Who didn't give a crap? Ruby. Get this. A few years ago, when her oldest daughter, Sherry, was 16 or 17, she'd been experiencing severe headaches for days on end. But one particular day, she started having a new symptom. She was losing a good portion of her field of vision. Hello? Then she began throwing up. Sherry and her dad, they were like, okay, you know what? It's time to go to the emergency room. My kid has a severe headache and is throwing up and losing vision. I may have even called an ambulance. Ruby? She told Sherry and Kevin that she was going to take a shower and then they would go to the hospital. I mean, pretty selfish and stupid when your kid could literally be having a stroke. But you know what? Ruby didn't just take a shower. No, she took an hour-long shower before pulling out her phone and recording herself talking about putting off going to the ER, and even recorded herself cleaning the bathroom while her daughter should have already been at the hospital.
I'm cleaning the sink, I'm cleaning the countertops, mopping the floor. I'm stalling. I think I'm ready now. I think I'm ready to leave. I put on a little bit of lip gloss and that will be as much stalling as I'll go. And so she woke up this morning and she's like, Mom, my vision is really blurry, like more blurry than it usually is. Kevin just came in. He's like, I think we need to take Sherry to the emergency room. I said, well, let me take a shower and then I'll be out. It's been an hour, so.
Sherry at the time was diagnosed with increased pressure in her brain and spinal column. Although it isn't deadly in and of itself, people with the condition can have permanent vision loss and have much higher rates of cardiac diseases and strokes. She was literally risking her daughter's life because she didn't want to have to deal with the boredom of sitting in an emergency waiting room. It's not hard to believe why Ruby's relationship with Sherry was ruined long before everything else came to light. Her oldest son was also singled out a lot. Chad, at one point, was sent to a troubled youth camp. Yes, with all the horror stories that have been coming out over the last decade, Ruby and Kevin Franke thought it was a good idea to send their 14-year-old kid to a camp in the desert that advertised that kids would be required to live off the land and would have to hike between 6 and 10 miles each and every day in Arizona. Now, I saw a clip of Chad talking about his experience there. Although he said that he didn't believe that he deserved to be sent to the camp, he said that for him, it was a good experience. You know what that tells me? That hiking 6+ miles in the Arizona desert and having to hunt and eat God knows what was better than life at home with his mother. Yikes. And then a few years after that, a clip came out where Ruby was talking to Chad and one of his sisters, and he let it slip that he hadn't had a bed in 7 months.
I've been sleeping on a beanbag since October.
Mind you, he was a minor, only 17, legally still a child. I tried to look it up to see if there were any laws in Utah that required a parent to provide a bed, but I wasn't able to find one that wasn't related to foster children. But even if it's legal, it certainly isn't ethical, is it? Regardless, what was the boy's crime? A prank. He woke his little brother up in the middle of the night, telling him to get dressed and packed because they were all going to Disney. Mean? Yes, but a more suitable punishment may have been a week-long grounding or something. Having his bed taken away for 7 months is incredibly excessive, in my opinion. Apparently, during that time, he slept on a beanbag chair in the family room. And Ruby laughed multiple times when he was telling his story on that video clip. But let's move on to the two youngest, who without a doubt received the worst of it. Now, I couldn't find much for how Russell was treated, but Eve, poor Eve. Now, that little girl was put through hell by the person who was supposed to love her the most. One school day, Ruby got a text message from her daughter's teacher asking her to bring her a lunch because she'd forgotten it. Ruby said that it was her daughter's responsibility to pack her own lunch and that the natural consequence for forgetting it was that she'd have to go hungry. She also said that she hoped that no one would take pity on her and give her a lunch because she had to learn a lesson. She was 6 years old.
Refusing to drop her then 6-year-old daughter's lunch off at school. These videos posted years before she was arrested and charged with aggravated child abuse.
And hopefully nobody gives her food and nobody steps in and gives her a lunch.
I could possibly understand if she was a teenager who was consistently forgetting her lunch, but a 6-year-old. And as many have pointed out, it isn't a natural consequence because an adult would usually still have the option of buying a lunch if they forgot theirs. And also, hoping that no one gives your child, your hungry child, food is downright sick. Another time, when Eve was younger, she'd gotten hold of a pair of scissors and had been cutting things in the house. Completely understandable to be very upset with your kid. Completely understandable. But how Ruby dealt with it was incredibly cruel and, in my opinion, sociopathic. She held up her daughter's favorite stuffed animal in front of her and threatened to cut its head off. I remember being a child, and I left my favorite stuffed animal, a pound puppy that I called Buttercup, at my aunt and uncle's house. I cried and cried until my mom called my uncle so I could ask him to keep Buttercup safe for me until I could get him back. Because for little kids, their favorite stuffed animal is their best friend, their security, their everything. Ruby threatening to essentially kill her stuffed animal is psychological torture, period. Then, in December of 2021, Ruby and her husband told their viewers that only 4 of their children, the older 4 of their children, would be getting presents that year. Why? Because, quote, the 2 youngest are showing long patterns of selfishness. They have shown through their choices and unwillingness to repent, their unwillingness to feel sorrow for some pretty egregious choices that they've made. They were 8 and 10 years old. They possibly still believed in Santa at the time. Mind you, these are the 2 children who were kept in a basement and were bound and starved. Tell me what egregious acts that an elementary school kid could be capable of. Not to mention that children are inherently selfish, as it's how children make sure that their needs get met. Altruism, which is doing good for others knowing that you won't benefit, is a learned behavior. I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, any altruism that they do have, they did not learn from their mother. Now, I want to jump in here and ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. I am trying to make this channel a full-time job, possibly, so I could bring you more morbid topics. I am only at over just 100 subscribers right now as I'm filming this, and my goal is to get to 500 subscribers by the end of next month. I know, it's a big goal. So, if you are morbid like me, help me get there by hitting the subscribe button now. Okay, let's get back to the video. Now, all of those things that I have described so far that Ruby inflicted on her kids was nothing like what was to come. So let's talk about the crimes that would end Ruby and her friend and business partner, Jody, in prison. Connections was an organization started in 2007 by Jody Hildebrandt, and it has been called a religious cult. It was supposed to be based on Mormon principles and help people be their best and help parents raise their children righteously, but it tended to actually rip families apart. For those unfamiliar with Mormonism, it is all about families, husbands and wives, mothers and fathers having many children. Mormons believe that it is their responsibility to bring souls into the world through having lots of babies. So it's not uncommon for Mormon families to have upwards of 6, 8, or more kids. In 2022, Ruby Franke suddenly deleted her YouTube channel, 8 Passengers, which had like 2 million followers, subscribers, what have you.
You wonder where I've been on my vlogs? You wonder why I left YouTube? It's to save my kids. No amount of money. And I'm telling you, I was making millions. And I left it because my kids were being hurt. With entitlement, they were being hurt. With people's advice.
Now, she said that it was, quote, out of concern for her children's well-being. Yeah, okay. At the same time, she joined up with Jodi Hildebrandt of Connections, where Ruby continued to spew her caustic parenting advice, and they often talked about whatever the hell distortion is. I literally could not find a definition for it, as they put it. But I can give you examples. Allowing your children to have privacy, distortion. A teen talking back to you, distortion. Loving your children unconditionally, distortion. I kid you not. Anyone who admits to loving rules more than their own children is a sociopath at the very least. The next year, August 30th of 2023, a 12-year-old boy showed up on the doorstep of a house in Ivins, Utah, asking for food and water. He had duct tape on his wrists and ankles. Of course, the police were immediately called, and when they arrived, they entered what turned out to be Jodi's house with probable cause and found a 10-year-old girl in the house who was in a similar state. At that point, those children, Russell and Eve, and their 2 sisters who were found at yet another residence of a friend of Ruby's, were all taken into state custody. The 2 children who were found at Jodi's house were brought to the hospital and began receiving treatment for physical injuries, starvation and malnutrition, and severe emotional harm. Those translated into 3 counts of aggravated child abuse for each child for both Jodi and Ruby. On the boy, it was discovered when the tape was removed that there were wounds underneath, and he told authorities that they, meaning Jodi and Ruby, had treated the wounds with cayenne pepper and honey. Okay. Mind you, Jodi had already had the cops show up at her house regarding her treatment of a teenage relative who had been left in her care. Unfortunately, it didn't seem like anything came from it, as the teen had to admit that she had never been physically harmed at the time in Jodi's care. And Jodi, who was a licensed therapist at the time, had her license changed to limited, which affected the scope of her practice. Anyway, 2 years later, she was placed on probation after she broke patient confidentiality and discussed a patient with leaders in the Mormon church. What? Also, a year before the arrests, police showed up at the Franke house after they received reports that the children who were minors had been left alone for days without any supervision, so Ruby could go spend time with Jodi in person. Mind you, Ruby's house was in Springville, Utah, and Jodi's house was in St. George, 3.5 hours away. But without anything else, and since the children refused to talk to police, I mean, understandable, they're terrified of the police because of their mother, the allegations weren't able to be substantiated. Later, the oldest Franke daughter, Sherry, who was away at college, called the police for a welfare check to make sure that her siblings were being fed and were safe. Ruby ended up taking a plea deal in exchange for her testifying against Jodi Hildebrandt. She claimed that Jodi essentially brainwashed her, which led her to the absolutely disgusting behavior towards the children. I don't buy it for one damn minute. Ruby was cruel and overbearing towards her children long before Jody became involved. The women appeared to fully believe that the abuse that they perpetuated on the children was an exorcism of sorts. The children were denied food for up to days at a time, hitting them and also forcing them to spend hours out in the sun, which in that part of Utah during that time of year was 100 degrees. Her children are incredibly lucky that they didn't die from exposure. Absolutely disgusting in my opinion, but Ruby's sentence is 4 to 30 years in prison. In what world is 4 years justice for locking your child in a basement and starving them among other tortures? The 10-year-old daughter, when found in a closet, was so absolutely terrified that it took the police almost 4 hours to coax her out. They only got her to come out when they bought her a pizza, which the 10-year-old child ate in its entirety. That poor little child, who did not deserve that, was starving. Ruby deserves to go to prison for decades for what she has put her children through. 4 years is revolting. And as for Jody, you guessed it, 4 to 30 years for having children locked up and starved in her basement. Absolutely abhorrent that either of these poor excuses for humans could be out and free in 4 years. But that's where we end today. Next week, we will look at the other evil Mormon mom, none other than Lori Vallow. But if you like today's video and you want to see more culty stuff from me, please check out my video When Religions Kill Their Own, where I discuss Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, and exorcisms. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to be merry but stay morbid.